Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our SG virtual event. This is our second workshop we are holding here on Startup Grind, which will be with Peter POEHLE from Sponsor My Event, as well also Conferencefilms, and he will give us some insight on event sponsoring and how the whole event industry has muted to online and also how you can benefit from it. Just beforehand, I would like to thank our local partners for making it available. This means we have BPM, CMS Law, Fox Strings, and Mixvoid. So, and without further ado, I would like to pass over to Peter. And if you have any questions, just put your questions in the chat. Thank you very much. Peter, your turn.
Hello, Steve. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your show. So it's always a pleasure to be here. And I think it's been an eternity that I'm following Startup Grind, and had some really memorable memories also attending Startup Grinds, both in Luxembourg, but also one time in New York, which was a great experience, also meeting some great people. So I believe that Startup Grind is really the perfect opportunity for people from the startup scene to connect and to mingle and to get also new insights, things that you haven't discovered yet, and can really recommend it for really everyone to just get connected and use also the networking possibilities of Startup Grind, which is great. And thanks also for inviting me, of course, for providing a little bit more information about virtual events, hybrid events, and all these buzzwords which are going around for the moment, especially as we have seen that many people are kind of a little bit lost in translation when it comes to all these different things. So, Steve, let me start actually by handing it over to you again. Do you have any questions right away? Something that you would like to know? Something that I should cover now in particular in this workshop?
But let's say so. First of most, I would like to know, and also that you explain a little bit, what is sponsorship per se, the different kinds of events, and also what is your experience on sponsorship, on event management, which link to it, I mean, the do's and don'ts, and also how it has evolved. I mean, you moved, or you still have Sponsor My Event, but also Conferencefilms. I guess there's a link in between. And anyway, I mean, if our attendees have any questions, they can shoot them in the chat.
Absolutely. More than happy to answer all the questions. And indeed, yeah, I mean, there's a link between Conferencefilms, Media 65, and Sponsor My Event. So my basically two companies. And one of the products of Conferencefilms you can see here right away, because the whole branded live stream here in this case is provided also by Conferencefilms, which is our specialty. But nevertheless, let's start first with our core topic, which is sponsorship. So I'm switching off. I just eliminated you now from the live stream, Steve, so it's very simple. Yeah, as you said, so I'm the CEO and the co-founder of Sponsor My Event, and Sponsor My Event is a marketplace that brings together event organizers and event sponsors. So we're mainly active in the US with over 60,000 event organizers who have signed up in the meanwhile. So going quite strong, working with some big brands also, of course. And for sure, with the time, you become kind of an expert in sponsorship when you work on Sponsor My Event, when you basically on a daily basis, you speak with event organizers, with event sponsors, you participate in calls and negotiation calls, you handle partly the negotiations for the event organizers, and at the same time also you learn how to guide or to provide the right guidance to push both event organizers and sponsors in the right direction to make sponsorship great, or as Americans would like to say, probably to make sponsorship great again. So, well, maybe a bad joke, but anyway. But coming to your first question also, so what is sponsorship by itself? I have seen very often that event organizers and sometimes also brand have maybe a certain misconception about the name or about the idea of what sponsorship by itself is. So let me provide in a nutshell really what sponsorship is. I'm speaking here mainly now of event sponsorship, but it applies of course also to other kind of sponsorships when it comes to sports people, artists, or all these things. So the main idea which is a foundation for every commercial sponsorship, is that there is an exchange between the one who's receiving the sponsorship, which is typically an event organizer or an artist or whatever, and on the other hand you have the giver, so the company, the brand, who actually provides the money or whatever is transferred to the receiver. And there's always an exchange. That means for that what the receiver is receiving, there's a return in visibility, and that qualifies sponsorship. So that was now maybe a very abstract definition, so it sounded horribly abstract, I know. To make it very easy and very simple to understand, an event organizer has an event, and he would like to have some money to make this event happen. So he's going to reach out to sponsors, and he's kind of selling his product, which is his event, to the sponsor, which is a brand, with always someone who has a commercial activity. And in return for the money that he's receiving from the brand, he will provide visibility to the brand. And that's exactly what qualifies also sponsorship. It's always this kind of visibility. So you have always a return for either some goods or some money, which is transferred from one side, from the brand, to the event organizer, and then on the other hand, the visibility is granted to the brand who's sponsoring. The visibility can be totally versatile. So it can be from simply having a logo in front of an audience. You have a nice example. For example, we have here under it, we have the logos of the sponsors of the Startup Grind. So that's kind of, I would say, a basic visibility. So putting a logo, but it can be also much more complex. And then we are speaking about sponsorship activations. That means all this which helps the sponsor to get visible in front of the audience. So this can, as I said, can be quite complex, which usually also a lot of sponsors are looking to have possibilities during events to connect to the audience, to be able to engage with the audience, to have the possibility to interact with the audience, which is really something which has evolved over the last years from being something very passive to something which is much more interactive and engaging also. One thing which is maybe quite important also to mention, that we're living today in a world of sponsorship where sponsorship should create kind of an added value also to the event. We had many years ago, it was still the idea that sponsorship was creating a win-win situation. That means a win for the organizer, of course, and a win for the sponsor, which is obvious. But today we're speaking more about sponsorship, which is creating a win-win-win situation. That means we have a third win, which is a win for the attendees, for the audience. And that means today event organizers should strive actually to bring in sponsors who are creating this event, this added value also for the whole audience. And as such, actually, the sponsors today, they easily become an integral part of the event and can help actually to make this event a success. So event organizers should never in their life, they should make the mistake and see sponsors as a pure cash cow. This is not the case. Actually, sponsors are for event organizers quite easily spoken partners, and partners who are helping to make the event a success. And that's something which is very often forgotten. That's why I emphasize so much on it. It's maybe a little bit the same situation that you have when you're in a startup and you're looking for an investor. An investor is also not only pumping some money into your startup, but he's coming on board kind of with maybe ideas, with connections, and he becomes kind of really a partner and someone who's helping to succeed, to make your venture actually a success. And that's not different for any event organizer, be it small event organizers, be it big organizers. Just before I'm finishing this chapter about how we can define sponsorship, let me just speak about the two main forms that sponsorship can take. It's either in cash or in kind sponsorship. In cash sponsorship is what we typically expect from sponsorship. That means you're providing the visibility to the brand, and the brand is giving you money. Just as simple as it could be. So that's what we call in cash sponsorship. In kind sponsorship is very similar, just that the visibility is not paid in money, in cash, but it's paid in kind. So in this case, a company could provide services to the event organizer, which are helping to set up or to make this event happen. And in return for these services, you simply get also the visibility as a brand. So a typical example could be that you have an event that you're organizing, and you don't want to spend any money now on the catering, but you have a catering service which might be new in town. They would like to have the visibility, they would like to get known, and as such they provide you a certain amount of catering free of charge. Turn, you will give them adequate visibility. So that would be a typical in-kind sponsorship. It can be the same also if you have some technical aspects. For example, if someone is providing a video projector free of charge, and in return he will get some visibility. All these things are in-kind sponsorship. So that's roughly what we can say as a definition about sponsorship. I could speak now much more about the history of sponsorship, of the different kinds of sponsorship which exist, also what inbound sponsorship is, but I think that would be definitely too much actually for this short workshop. Now Steve, your second question was more about the different kind of events which are taking place, and I would like to put a focus now here also more on virtual events of different kinds, because that's something which is for the moment, as we said at the beginning, really the buzzwords, and it creates a lot of buzz. So let me try to make also a definition about the different kinds of virtual events we have, so that we can start to distinguish, because really there's a lot of confusion about these different terms. I think everybody in the last weeks or even months has participated almost in some kind of virtual event, which can be as simple as being a conference call between several participants, which is what I would say the most basic virtual event that could take place. But then we have also webinars. So what is a webinar? Webinar is typically a virtual event where you have one person or maybe two or three people who are presenting certain things, and very often in a webinar also these people are not even visible in the camera, but very often they show only a PowerPoint presentation, they share their screen, and they run through the presentation, you hear their voice, but you don't necessarily see them, so it's definitely not something which is like a branded live stream or something. What qualifies a webinar is that you have typically a quite large audience of people who are attending this webinar, who are listening, and who might also in a limited way interact also with the presenters by adding certain questions and speaking then with them. Usually the audience is quite large, so you can have webinars easily where you have several hundred people or even more who are attending. But the interaction actually between the event or between the presenter and the audience is more or less limited. Then you have online seminars, which are again a little bit different, because typically in an online seminar you have those who are running the seminar, so the moderators who are visible and audible also. That means you see the people, you can even also raise your hand and you can speak with the people. You might be visible as well then through your live stream. Typically an online seminar is something which is meant or targeted as a smaller audience, so you have typically 10, 15, maybe 20 people who are working together quite intensively on one topic, and where the participation actually of the audience is explicitly also wanted and desired. The interaction here is much more intense compared to webinar, and of course also compared to the classic live stream where you just simply see something and you cannot interact at all, except maybe over some comments on YouTube or other channels. And then we can move up and we can go to virtual conferences and hybrid conferences. So here we are again in a different field. Because virtual conferences or hybrid conferences are kind of replicas of real-world conferences. So you just need to imagine that you have a conference where you have maybe several hundred attendees, and you have a series of panelists, people who are speaking. Then you have individual speakers, you have panels, panel discussions, etc. And all this concept can be transferred and transformed into the virtual world as well. So that's what we speak about a virtual conference, when such a live stream or such a virtual conference is taking place. And typically you would have, for a good virtual conference, you would have a branded live stream like we have here, where you can see a moderator who's guiding through the conference. Then it switches over to the first panelist or to the first speaker. You have his speech, and this person is usually connected from cyberspace. That means virtually connected. But then you can also, of course, have panel discussions where you might have on the panel 6, 7, 8 people simultaneously. And all this is actually streamed out to the audience who has registered, and has also a very similar actually to webinar, the possibility also to interact with a panelist, with a moderator, but not in a way or to a degree that we described for online seminars. So it's a little bit more limited. Typically it's limited on texting, so you can write your Q&As. There's very often there are polls, there are votings, etc. for questions. So interaction is there, but in a different way as, for example, for online seminars. And typically, of course, virtual conferences are running a little bit longer than a normal webinar, because you have you have more participants, more speakers, and it can be easily that you have such a virtual conference which is going for 2, 3, 4 hours, depending, sometimes even more. So it's really kind of a replica from the normal real life conference, just in the virtual world. Interesting about this is, of course, that the virtual conference can flex its muscles when it comes to bringing in speakers and attendees from all across the world. So you have possibilities that you never had before, because all of a sudden you can connect a speaker who's physically in Japan. At the same time, you can connect a speaker who's physically sitting in San Francisco, another one who's sitting in New York, and another one maybe in Brisbane or so. All those can connect. Good luck for the time zones. That's the only problem that you might have then. But you have really the possibility to bring all these speakers together in the virtual conference, show them at the same time, and interact. And then at the same time, of course, the audience can be also very broad. So you might have much more participants as you would have for a normal conference. So we had recently with one of our clients, we had the experience. They are organizing quite a lot of events across Europe, and typically you have physical attendees, let's say 300 to 400 attendees. Now they organized for the first time a virtual conference. They had 800 people signed up and 500 people attending real. So that's quite huge actually for a two-hour virtual conference. But you see what kind of potential is behind there, and people really like actually to participate in such things because they don't have to travel. They can do it from their home. They can do it from the office. So it's quite flexible. Then the next element or the next format that we need to speak about are hybrid events, where virtual conferences are still easy to understand what a virtual conference is. It becomes a little bit more complicated when it comes to hybrid conferences. On the other hand, hybrid conferences are definitely not very difficult because they are actually a combination between a real conference and a virtual conference. That means typically what we as producers of such conferences, what we would do, we would have a conference which is taking place as the conference would take place in the normal situation. That means you would have your speakers being physically present, you would have at least a certain amount of attendees in the public, and then at the same time we would be there with cameras, we would film everything, but we would connect this real world, we would connect it through a broadcast system with a virtual world where you have all the speakers who would also connect like for a virtual conference, and this is mixed together so that both those people, attendees who are physically present, can see the physical speakers. They can see the virtual speakers projected on a screen. And at the same time, also the virtual attendees, they, through the live stream, they would have the possibility to see, of course, the real live attendees, and at the same time also those who are virtually connected. What becomes more interesting even is that for a hybrid conference, there are very good solutions, also software solutions, which enable both those attendees on site and those who are virtual to interact in the same way with the panelists, with the moderators, as that would be the case if there would be only a normal real life conference. That means you would connect both if you're the virtual attendee or the normal physical attendee, you would connect over your smartphone, and you would have the possibility to type in certain questions. They would arrive right away at the moderator. The moderator could also launch some polls, etc. And as such, you would have the same possibilities just to interact as if you would be on the place. So that's quite fascinating. And in my opinion, hybrid events will clearly also be the future of events, because most of the events probably will become hybrid. Event organizers have seen now how important it can be to have virtual events, and having hybrid events combining really the best of both worlds is something which is way to go, because you will never have, at least not in the foreseeable future, the flexibility and the possibilities we had in the past to travel. And at the same time, you can make your conferences, your virtual events, so much bigger by adding this hybrid component also, so that it makes perfect sense actually to organize that. The third aspect that I would like to speak about is, of course, sponsorship, and how sponsorship is changing also when it comes to virtual events. Doesn't matter what kind now. First of all, where we had before locally clearly limited events, where you would know exactly that this event is attracting a certain amount of people from a certain geographical region. This is not necessarily anymore the case for virtual events. Virtual events are by definition international, or can be at least international, or much more open or much more broad. That means also the kind of sponsors and the size of sponsors that you are reaching out to might be different compared to the sponsors that you would reach out when it comes to normal physical events. All of a sudden, for your event, which can become more international, all of a sudden you might reach out to a brand which is operating more on a national or maybe on a global scale even, because they will see an audience in your event which would not have been there before. So that's one of the first big differences. Second is that, of course, you need to be aware that the audience is not necessarily an audience which might sit for 3-4 hours just in front of the screen and watching your presentation, but the audience might come and might go depending on what is interesting for them. So you have it already kind of in real events also, where you see that people go out of the conference room, they come back, they go out, they have a drink, they come back, etc. This is much more intense also when it comes to virtual events. So people are not necessarily sitting there and waiting that something is happening. That's why you need to kind of make your sponsorship activations also in a different way, either that they are more visible or more catchy. And of course, you need also to adapt your way of having some virtual presence of some logos, of some sponsors. So that's today also different. You need to come up with interesting activations. Just putting a logo somewhere is not necessarily anymore something which is really interesting. So also in the virtual space, you might want to give your sponsors a possibility to engage with the audience. This could be, when we take the example of a virtual conference, it could be that you have several rooms which are open, not only several rooms for speakers, but also several rooms where you have sponsors who could run their own presentations eventually, and who could also host certain one-on-one meetings with people, who could provide a certain added value also to the conference. All this can be created also in the virtual space, but this needs to be planned, of course, ahead. And you need to see, of course, also what other possibilities you have. In the virtual world, it's very easy actually to just play all of a sudden a video like an advertising from a sponsor or some video message or so. That's very easy. It's not necessarily very easy to do this on a real event, but here you can do it. You can have stinger transitions where you just show very quickly something from the sponsor, etc. But I would also go even beyond these kind of more traditional activations, and I would see what can you really do? How can you create an added value also for your sponsors in the digital, in the virtual world, so that the sponsor is actually contributing to the success of your event. This could be, for example, by providing additional technical possibilities, by, for example, having some additional content which is provided by a sponsor. So let's say like this, you have interesting information or interesting resources that a sponsor can provide, and you can showcase these during the virtual conference. Sometimes in a virtual conference, this might be technically much easier to do it compared to a normal event. So that's something where you need to have a clear vision actually of what you would like to do. And my recommendation is clearly also get your sponsors on board really as soon as possible, because you might want to speak and discuss and work with them also on what is possible today, and especially also unleash your creativity. That's something which is very important, because today virtual events, and especially also the graphical possibilities that we have, they're kind of like a canvas. That means you have all the possibilities. What you do with these possibilities is a complete different question, because you have all the possibilities and you just got to use them actually. So as you can see, we have created the template which is adapted to the CI, the branding of Startup Grind. We have included the logos of the sponsor. We have my name tag here, for example, included some more information about myself on the side. All these are elements which are even, I would say, rather basic, because you can go much further by having additional sessions. You have the possibility eventually to display dynamic information while someone is speaking, which are linked to the sponsor. So that would be a possibility, not mentioning even the whole possibilities of having videos embedded at any moment in such a live stream. So it's more that you should see it like an interactive TV channel and handle it also as such. And then of course, when you come up with such ideas, you need to think about the pricing also, and what kind of pricing you will apply when it comes to the sponsor, because your scope of your event might be different. So as I mentioned before, a client, instead of having 300-400 people on the place, they had all of a sudden 700-800 people registered, 500 people present, which is much different actually from what they usually typically had in the physical world. And that's something which pays off. So you have some added value that you can propose to your sponsors, which makes it much more interesting, of course, to do so. Then the last aspect that I would like to speak about is how can you organize such a virtual conference. What do you need actually to set up something like this and make it really nice and memorable also for your participants? I would say the first thing what is required is, of course, you need to have the concept. So you need to have an interesting and compelling concept, because without having some content that you would like to speak about, it simply doesn't work. So you need to have either yourself, if you're speaking well, you need to be the one who's moderating the whole thing. Either you need to have a moderator, you need to have good panelists who can provide information. So all this, what you would need also for a normal conference, you require as well for a virtual conference. Biggest advantage is, of course, all these virtual participants and panelists, you can bring them in much easier because they don't have to travel. They just need to connect maybe for 1 hour, for half an hour, for 20 minutes maybe, and be present virtually. Then on the other hand, you need to have kind of the technical infrastructure. I mean, we all know Zoom, WebEx, all these possibilities, which are great, of course, if you want to have a reliable and stable way to run something. But you will miss in any way, be it with WebEx, be it with Zoom or other solutions, you will not have this branded experience that you might expect maybe also from kind of a TV broadcast. So here in this case, we work in a little bit different ways. So we have added these branded elements, and just simply adding a couple of elements make it already quite different. So you have the possibilities to add these things. But of course, for this, you need to have specialized software, you need to have specialized hardware. So that's where those event or virtual event providers come into play, such as Conferencefilms or of course also others. I mean, we're by far not the only ones who are doing these things. But typically what happens is actually, just as we do it here now, we have our kind of regie, which is in our headquarter. We have our broadcast software running on it, and we administrate everything basically from our headquarters. So it's also virtual, the video production. We make sure that all those elements which are going to be in the show, like Steve, for example, live, like the text elements, that they are all coming basically and are concentrated in our broadcast studio. They are treated, they are mixed together, and then they are sent out as a live stream. Now in this case here, we are actually connecting to Zoom and broadcasting everything over the Zoom. The quality is not necessarily the best, sorry Zoom to say, but it could be a little bit better. Typically, if you would have a virtual conference, you might also want to stream it over YouTube and embed it then in other systems. You can stream it over Vimeo. So the sky is really the limit, because you have so many different possibilities to stream it, even also on simultaneous multiple destinations. So you can perfectly stream one conference both on Facebook, on Vimeo, but also on Facebook, on YouTube, on LinkedIn Live if you have an account for LinkedIn. So there are many different possibilities to do this. At the same time, of course, everything can be recorded, can be replayed later. So you have flexibilities actually when you do these things. The only thing that you need, of course, you need to have kind of the skills to do it, and you need to have the necessary hardware and software, which is also unfortunately quite expensive to do it. And if you want to do it really nicely actually, and you want to do a hybrid event, then of course you need to have some broadcast cameras, some good cameras who are enabling you to have a good quality in this case. So that's really in a nutshell actually what a live conference or a virtual conference could be. Now I'm going to go over again to Steve, so that we can maybe discuss some questions also from the audience, because I'm pretty sure that there are, or I hope at least that there are some questions that we could answer.
Yes, thank you, Peter, so far. Yes, there are some of them. One of them is, you touched up already upon it, but one of the issues, do you think that on the economics of sponsoring events, of financing your events as an organizer, has changed due to, let's call it, the COVID crisis and so on?
Yes, it has clearly changed. I mean, first of all, I think both event organizers but also sponsors have found themselves in a completely new situation, which is uncomparable to anything which happened before. That means organizers were kind of also in a situation where they said, "Oh my God, what are we going to do now, and how can we handle with this?" So they were shifting to virtual events, hybrid events, etc. At the same time, also sponsors, they also didn't know how to handle this. I mean, we had the situation in America just before the crisis, mid of March, where I had been in negotiations both for one event which was taking place in Hawaii and another one which was taking place in Portland, or actually in Washington. Both events were quite big, and the sponsors were committed. They wanted to do it, and all of a sudden the sponsors had to cancel everything because they couldn't commit anymore. So their headquarters, and the one was a big insurance company, the other one was a big real estate company, they had clearly from up, they had said, okay, we cannot commit anymore for any event on the foreseeable future. So that this changed everything, and now it starts again that sponsors, also brands, are trying to find a new way actually how to get into these virtual events. I was contacted also by certain sponsors who told me clearly, please bring me virtual events. We would like to sponsor virtual events. So the metrics and the foundations have indeed changed. And as such, also, of course, the economy behind, because calculations, how virtual events are sponsored, the budgets, etc. Of course, that's slightly different. So it's a new situation, which everybody tries to find its way through the situation.
And how would you see it, for example, for charities? Sorry, because there have been many charity events before doing fundraising and so on. Now it has been more, okay, let's get active. But if now a charity would like to start again its fundraising, be it with an event or something else, is there something which you think has changed or which you would eventually recommend or not recommend? Let's call it like that.
Well, I believe that actually for charity events, the same rules apply as for other events. That means they need to go virtual, kind of, or at least they need to go hybrid to make sure that this critical mass of attendees is already there. If you try now for the moment to organize an event where nobody is coming, a physical event, then you will not have any sponsors. That's for sure. If on the other hand you can come up with a concept where you say, okay, we're going virtual, and at the same time we have the possibility also to provide the sponsor actually with some visibility beyond what is physically possible, then this makes perfect sense to the sponsor. So as such, also a charity event needs really to dive their feet, their toes into this water of virtual events and need to see actually how they can virtualize their events or hybridize their events, because otherwise the sponsors will inevitably also turn to those organizers who have made the step already and who are able to provide kind of this virtual world to the sponsors. That's basically not only applicable to charitable events, but overall to all the events.
Another question was mainly what would be the logical steps? I mean, somebody who organized events beforehand, would you say they should jump immediately into hybrid events, or should they first start with virtual only event? Okay, let's say a webinar, and then eventually move to the next part of a virtual conference with breakout rooms, and then move to hybrid events.
I would say someone who probably doesn't have much experience organizing events, real life events, probably should start doing first real virtual events. For the simple reason, organizing a virtual event is, I would not say it's easy to do it, but you have much less costs up front. You have much less organizational hurdles because you don't have any travel, accommodation, rooms that you need to rent. Technically, I would say within one day you can set up the whole infrastructure for a virtual event without any problems, and you're good to go simply. So that's why I would recommend that definitely they should start with virtual events first, and then as soon as they see, okay, this works, they can grow these virtual events and eventually also move on then simply to do some physical events, or of course hybrid events, where they can leverage also all the benefits and all the contacts they have collected through their virtual events. And that's something which is a strength. The big problem, of course, is also if you're organizing a virtual event, you need to make sure that enough people are connecting to your virtual event. That means you need to have a long list of email addresses, or you need to run certain ads so that enough people are aware of this event. Because the downside is, of course, as it is kind of easy to organize a virtual event, you might be facing a lot of competition also from others who have also great ideas. So today, basically, everybody can organize a virtual event, and only those who are doing it well will stand out of the crowd. They will receive the sponsorship, and they will receive also the audience. And that's something which is more kind of the problem that people are facing today.
On the other hand, looking a little bit also at economics, I see here is if you organize real life events, physical events, you know, okay, what are the costs and what are the logistics and the organization. Whereas with virtual event, it completely moves. I mean, you don't need to care about the catering, you don't need about the venue and so on, but you need to take more care about eventually the technical side also. But also on the other hand, could be that you have a bigger crew for your physical events and lead a smaller crew for your virtual events, and you can do more.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a lot of overhead which is going away when you are doing a virtual event. So you mentioned catering, the whole logistics, travel logistics, and everything like this. Things which indeed are extremely time consuming. When we work, for example, on a regular basis, we work with the European Investment Bank on certain conferences, and I can tell you, this is really actually a job when they're organizing conferences somewhere in Europe to bring all the participants in there. So there are really several people who are working and doing nothing else than taking care of the whole logistics and making sure that everybody will be at the right place at the right moment. Doing so for a virtual event can be done by a much smaller team. So it's more simply about being very well organized and making sure that you really streamline all your efforts and do the things. And there it becomes more important also, of course, to know as much as possible about the technical aspects. So what can I do technology-wise to make such a virtual conference happen, and to really use this knowledge as an added value compared to other people. And then also, of course, you have always the possibility to make it rather simple by using simply Zoom or WebEx, which is nothing wrong about this. But if you want to have something which stands out a little bit of the crowd by having kind of this branded live stream, then of course you need to invest also some money, unless you're really skilled and can do it even yourself, which I would not necessarily recommend, because then it becomes quite easily overwhelming also. But they need to invest some money. I mean, we had also the case now that we have been speaking organizers and they wanted us to make it virtual, and so we came up with a price for such a virtual event, and they were a little bit surprised because they said, but that's the same price as we would pay if we would make a live video, actually on the event itself, on a physical event. And I said, yeah, well, it's not really different actually, because the time that we have to invest and also kind of the material that we have to invest in making such a virtual broadcast branded and here and there is not so different actually from the time that we need to spend to stand physically with a camera there. So that at first they were a little bit surprised, but then they understood very well how much time it costs, and that was then easily explained. But nothing comes for free, I mean, that's for sure. And if you want to have quality, then it will also, in any way, it will cost. But for sure, your team will be reduced, and maybe also responsibilities will shift.
Okay, on this qualitative, positive news, and also, let's say, point, we would like to thank you for your time and sharing with us your experience. And also, if there are any questions in the audience, you can still shoot an email to me, and then we will forward to Peter. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, for having me. It was a pleasure, and thank you very much to all the audience, and I hope you really liked it, and hope to see you soon again, very soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.